Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Shripad Joshi. I'm one of the volunteers at CSPC, and today I am delighted to welcome you all for an insightful panel discussion titled Sowing Security, the Agricultural Sector and the Canada's Defense Industrial Strategy, which is actually the part of CSPC's running series of panels on defense industrial strategy. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually, we are all joining from various traditional territories across the Turtle Island. I'm joining you today from Hamilton, Ontario, which is the traditional territories of Haudenosaunee, Atinwonderok, Mississauga, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe. We recognize that enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous people across Canada and are grateful for the opportunity to gather and share knowledge on these lands. I invite our attendees to share their land acknowledgements in the chat as we start. Before we dive into the discussion, we have an exciting update regarding the accessibility. Today, we are testing a simultaneous interpretation through the Worldly app, which is right here on Zoom. How you can participate is for captions, you should see an option on your screen to enable the Wordly app. You can select your preferred language there to see a live transcript of our conversations as we go along. For audio, we are dropping a special link in the chat right now. If you open that link in a separate browser or on your device, you'll be able to listen to the live audio in English or in French. When using the web link for audio, please mute the main Zoom window to avoid hearing two voices, that is the original speaker and the interpretation, or avoid an echo. Since we are piloting this technology, we may have some problems. Make sure our panels are this is our attempt to make sure our panels are more inclusive. We would appreciate your patience and would love your feedback as we work to increase the bilingual accessibility for our audience and to break down the language barriers in real time. Today, we have with us Dr. Shayan Sharif, who is a distinguished research chair in Agri-Food Biosecurity, who's also the Associate Dean and Research and Graduate Studies uh, at University of Guelph, uh, who's also the moderator of today's panel. So I'm going to pass it on over to him, and I'm going to welcome him first. Welcome, Dr. Sharif, and it's over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Joshi, for the kind introduction and also for setting the stage for today's panel. It is indeed my great pleasure to be here today. And first of all, I'd like to thank CSPC for taking the leadership on this very important topic, very timely and very critical to our national sovereignty. And also, I'd like to say my appreciation to my colleagues around the table, around this virtual table, the panelists. We have 4 panelists today. I'd like to introduce them right now, and then I have a few introductory remarks that I would like to make. But prior to that, let me also have a couple of housekeeping messages for you from the organizers. Number one is that we are going to have some time for questions and answers by the audience, approximately 10-15 minutes at the very end. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom. The chat line is only there to communicate some of the general comments or messaging the panelists. So please use the Q&A feature. And also, instead of repeating questions, please upvote a question that you would like to be answered. And we will be monitoring the chat and also monitoring the Q&A feature to make sure that we are not missing any of your important questions. So let me introduce the panel here. I have Mr. Brody Berrigan. He is the Senior Director of Government Relations and Farm Policy at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. I have Dana Dickerson, who is the Director of Market Development and Sustainability with Grain Farmers of Ontario. I also have Virginia Mulligan, who's the Director of Agriculture and Food Innovation at Alberta Innovates. And last but not least, I have Ian Affleck, who's the Vice President of Plant Biotechnology for CropLife Canada. As you can see, we have been able to, I can't really take any credit for this. This is the CSPC who's been able to really put together a very good, excellent group of thought leaders in agriculture and decision makers in agriculture. So this panel is going to be quite, I would say, important and foundational in terms of, setting the stage for the future. But in terms of my own introductory remarks, if we were to talk about food security, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, it would have meant something quite different than it means now. Traditional discussions about national security, as an example, would have focused on defense, intelligence, energy, more recently, critical minerals and critical infrastructure. And over the last several years, over the last probably even, not several years, but perhaps, the last just couple of years, some events have highlighted another reality. A nation's resilience depends fundamentally on the ability to produce, process, move, and access food under many different conditions of uncertainty and disruption. I don't necessarily need to highlight all of those conditions. I'm speaking to a very learned community of thought leaders in not only agriculture, but I'm imagining in defense and so forth. But just to give you a few of those, we've already witnessed the impacts of pandemics, some of the geopolitical tensions, some of the impacts of climate-related events that have led to supply chain disruptions. Now we are getting a better sense of what cybersecurity could actually mean for our agricultural sector. And something that is near and dear to me, which is emerging animal diseases. As we speak, we are still struggling to mitigate the risk of avian influenza virus. And while we haven't really mitigated the risk, we have other diseases that are just banging on our door. Shall I talk about hantavirus? Shall I talk about Ebola virus? Should I talk about African swine fever? Some of those are just, clear and present risks, and some of them are somewhere on the horizon. So together, all of these challenges have exposed our vulnerabilities in global food systems, not just in Canada, but across the globe. And they've raised important questions about our nation's preparedness. Our prime minister actually even, identified this and verbalized it much better than I could ever do. He said in his famous speech at Davos, he said, a country that cannot feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. And I could not have said it better in the context of today's discussion. So the central question for us today is not whether or not food security matters, because it's becoming quite clear for all of us that it does matter. But it's how Canada should think about food security as a strategic capability. And this panel is going to be focusing on what sort of capabilities Canada should develop and maintain to ensure resilience. Where are those critical vulnerabilities? Have you been able to identify them? Have we been able to develop strategies to mitigate the risk of those vulnerabilities? How much capacity do we need domestically? And what sort of balance should we strike between efficiency and redundancy? And how do we create conditions for innovation while we are ensuring that regulation, policy, and investment would support national resilience? So this panel is going to be talking about all of those. And these questions are particularly timely as Canada considers its defense industrial strategy. So you're going to see us going back and forth talking about the defense industrial strategy and broader approaches to sovereignty, preparedness, and economic security. Food systems are not separate from any of these discussions, and they're becoming increasingly central to them. But despite all of that, food was not given any space within the defense industrial strategy. And I might be asking the panelists to comment on that. So today's discussion and panel would bring leaders with expertise spanning from various different aspects of agriculture. And I think this is going to be a very lively and productive panel, and I very much look forward to that. So let me just begin the discussion by asking our panelists. And Ian, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go to you first alphabetically. So I'm going to go to Ian, and I'm going to ask you, Ian, about the defense strategy. And let me just make sure that I'm not straying away, from the script, that was given to me. Uh, it- it- let's talk about the defense strategy and your take on the defense industrial strategy and the relationship between that strategy and the agriculture and agri-food sector, and any connections that you can find between the defense strategy and the future of agri-food sector.
Yeah, and I think just at the outset of it all, and maybe to be very presumptuous and rewrite Prime Minister Carney's speech right off the bat, I think if we're being positive toward agriculture, a country that can't feed or fuel itself cannot defend itself. So we'll try to raise our importance as much as we can by just switching a few words there. But I think this approach to an industrial strategy is different than we've seen before. There's a lot of opportunity for agriculture to fit in here. In the past, defense strategies have been mostly about procurement of ships or tanks or whatever it might be, but the physical procurement of machinery or armaments. This time, we're seeing that there's a shift away from simply the products, but to the systems and the national capabilities that are necessary to defend yourself if need be. So that kind of switches the focus from individual purchasing of products to things like research institutions or specialized talents, commercialization pathways. So even if agriculture can't find itself directly in there, I think there's a great opportunity for agriculture to benefit for whatever advancements are made as they do research and innovation in those spaces as well. Not just researching warships, but researching commercialization pathways for new technologies in metallurgy so that we can make better ships in our own yards. And when those pathways come into place, how can we adopt those back into the agricultural sector? Being a little more specific on the ag side, why should we fit in here? I think you can look at defense as both physically defending your country when at times of physical conflict, and you need the foodstuffs and the fuel stuffs to manage that in that moment. But there's also defense in the time of geopolitical disruption and trade. And Canada's a net exporter of food, and that is almost like it's not just food, it's like goodwill. It is something we put on the table around the world that gives us a positive relationship with other countries who then want to work with us and maybe not want to be on the other side of geopolitical tensions. So I think within the strategy, agriculture does have a place. Do we as agriculture have to figure out how to make that more apparent? But even if we're not there by name, a lot of opportunities as innovation takes place under this strategy for ag to learn or adopt or share experiences there. So that might be my opening comments.
That's absolutely wonderful, Ian. And I'm probably going to come back to this, towards the very end. But you raised a couple of very interesting points that even though agriculture is not mentioned, in a very cut and dry fashion, there are a lot of things that can be drawn from that strategy, and there's a lot that agriculture can offer. I'm imagining that, productivity and how agriculture has maintained productivity among other industrial sectors that have suffered from lags in productivity is something that can be leveraged from understanding better how agricultural practices are done and how those can be applied to some of defense industrial strategies. But before I go on a tangent, let me go to other panelists. Brody, you're next person on my agenda because of alphabetical order that I would like to follow. So please go ahead, Brody.
That's a very logical sequence, so I applaud that. Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here today, Dr. Sharif and the CSBS. I think this is a really important subject, so we appreciate the invitation. This idea, this concept of food security as national security and its relevance for the defense industrial strategy is something we've been exploring now for several months at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. For those who aren't aware, the CFA is Canada's largest general farm organization. So we represent farmers, about 190,000 farmers and farm families across the country. We think that Canada's agriculture and agri-food sector is one of the most strategic assets we have in this country. It employs over 2 million people, contributes about 150 billion to our GDP, and it positions Canada as a stable and trusted food supplier globally. Over the past few years, we've seen how vulnerable supply chains can be. This started, I think it really, I mean, this is an enduring consequence, but really brought to light during the Russia-Ukraine conflict a few years ago, and then really brought to light again more recently in Iran. So whether due to those geopolitical tensions, pandemics, as you mentioned, climate events as well. I mean, we often don't think about that so much in a defense context, but those are significant contributors to our vulnerability in that sense as well as trade disruptions. Dr. Sharif talked about the need to balance efficiency and redundancy in his open remarks. This is a fundamental question from our perspective. It speaks to a real sort of pivot that's happening right now in international relations from, a post-World War II Cold War era of driving towards international efficiency in trading relationships to, I would say, increasingly over the past year or two, an increasing sort of retrenchment of countries looking at their own domestic capabilities and some of the trade-offs therein. For agriculture, these risks are not theoretical. They show up in the availability of inputs like fertilizer, crop protection, veterinary products, and in our ability to access markets. That's why we think strategic autonomy, you referenced the PM's remarks in Davos, must include strong domestic production capacity, stable, predictable regulatory frameworks, and integrated but resilient supply chains with key trading partners, including the United States. And I think it's important to stress that. Strategic autonomy in this sense is not about isolation, and it cannot be about isolation for Canada. We are a trading nation and we rely on trade to support our quality of life. It's not about reducing trade or stepping back from integration with our closest allies. In fact, the Canada-US agri-food relationship is a perfect example of how deep integration can strengthen our resilience together when it's supported by predictable rules-based trade. There are conditions there, of course. Integration only really works when it's balanced and when both sides maintain that capacity to produce, innovate, and respond independently when necessary. So from a policy perspective, at the CFA, this means a few things. First, we need to ensure that our regulatory system supports timely access to innovation for farmers. I know Ian talked a little bit about that, and I'm sure that's a subject we'll go a little bit deeper on here today. But it can include anything from new crop protection tools, seed technologies, veterinary products, et cetera. Delays and uncertainty, they don't just affect our competitiveness, they can direct our food production capacity as well. And I think that's really important. Second, we need to think more strategically about the full agri-food value chain, from inputs to processing to transportation. We need to look at it from a whole systems perspective. Strategic autonomy requires not just that production, but the ability to maneuver, process, deliver food reliably. And that's why we've been advocating at the CFA for a critical farm input strategy that ensures stable, timely, affordable access to essential inputs for Canadian farmers. And the third thing I wanted to say is we need to better recognize agriculture as a national priority. I think that's where we need to start here. And part of the reason why it's not reflected in the defense industrial strategy as it stands right now. When governments are making decisions about trade or infrastructure or industrial strategy, agriculture has to be at the table, not as an afterthought, but as a foundational sector. So I would just say, if Canada wants to be a strong, reliable partner in a more uncertain world, as the Prime Minister outlined in his remarks, and you referenced, Dr. Sharif, then we have to be equally strong at home. And that includes ensuring our farmers and our entire agri-food system remain productive, competitive, and resilient. Because a country, as you said, that can't feed itself or support its role in feeding others internationally is never going to reach that ideal of strategic autonomy. So that's my opening salvo on this discussion. Thank you.
That was outstanding. Thank you very much. As a person who came from the Middle East, I'm originally from Iran, and you talked about the Strait of Hormuz, even though you didn't mention it in name, but the reality is that this was a known fact. Even 50 years ago, I was just going back to some of the old documents. Even 50 years ago, there were discussions about what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked for whatever reasons. And I would have hoped, I would have thought that, over the last 50 years, we would learn some lessons. Not meaning, Canadians, but generally speaking, all of us globally would understand better some of the geopolitical tensions that you and I talked about, Brody. And I was quite hopeful that, that would have led to some strategies, some tactiques, some approaches to mitigate the risk, but it hasn't. Hopefully, this is going to be a wake-up call yet again, and hopefully, this would really trigger a lot of other actions, including, for example, some of the actions that you just mentioned, which is to put agriculture as a fundamental and indispensable part of our strategies for the future, for our sovereignty, for our national sovereignty in the future. So, having said that, let me go to you, Dana. And again, I'm doing it alphabetically, even though probably it's not the best, most logical way of doing it, but let's go to you, Dana, and then lastly, I'm going to go to Virginia.
Thanks, Dr. Sharif. And I'm glad we're going alphabetically because it's a hard act to follow Ian and Brody. They said many of the things that I was going to say. So I will build off some of those thoughts and hopefully don't, I'm sure I won't cover it all. I'm sure there'll be lots for Virginia to cover on her end. So for those of you who don't know Grain Farmers of Ontario, we're the largest commodity association in the province of Ontario. We represent 28,000 farmers growing barley, corn, oats, wheat, and soybeans. And within Canada, our farmers lead production for corn, which is Canada's third largest crop by volume, for soy, which is Canada's third largest crop by value, and for winter wheat, which wheat is Canada's largest crop. We grow about 8% of it, but we grow about 81% of Canada's winter wheat. So my job at GFO is to sort of look at market development opportunities and work with the downstream value chains. So I bring a bit of a perspective on what's happening on the farm and how we ensure sustainability and resilience for farmers, but also the downstream value added processing that all of our grains go into as grain ingredients. And I'd like to pick up where Brody left off, sort of on this concept of agriculture being foundational to food security and the comments that Prime Minister Carney made at Davos. Social stability is foundational to national security. Some of the greatest historical threats to social stability have arisen when populations have lost to food. So you think about the French Revolution, you had years of poor crops, you had bread prices going out of control, and France descended into all kinds of issues and effectively civil war. So to have national security, we really do need to have a strong foundation of productive food security. We need to have resilient farms, diversified production, value-added processing, and a very secure value chain that is going to support that social stability. When I look at the defense industrial strategy, to me, it looks like as Ian said, a pretty coherent, integrated, and bold vision with a lot of ambition. I'd say the proof is in the execution of these things, right? It's a big vision. We've seen visions for agriculture before. I think you've got to pay a fee if you mention the Barden Report first in conversation like these, because it often gets pulled up as sort of a vision for agriculture that we haven't fully executed on within Canada, but there's a lot in this that sort of harkens back to some of that. Some of the things I see that kind of cut across that gets right and that I would like to see for agriculture policy is that it recognizes that industrial capacity is a strategic asset, not simply an economic asset. It acknowledges this disruption of global supply and demand patterns and the assumptions that we can no longer hold in the same way that we have during this sort of period of globalization in agricultural trade. Does a lot of it's self-reflective for government. It acknowledges a lot of bottlenecks to investment, innovation, and prosperity, and it commits to trying to tackle those. And those are certainly issues that we see within agriculture. And there's two elements of it that I really like, this sort of concept of dual use technologies, or trying to kill two birds with one stone, which I think there's a lot of opportunities in agriculture to do those sorts of things. And this sort of build, partner, buy framework that they introduce. So when I kind of contrast that to agriculture and what we need in agriculture, we have a really strong agricultural base, and I know grains best. I'd focus on those. That's really a foundation of a lot of our food system. So we have this really strong grain agricultural production base for a lot of our critical food staples. So ingredients for flours, oils, starches, feed, protein, all those sorts of things. We need to make sure that we're securing our ability to produce these affordably for the long term. So what Brody was talking about in terms of critical inputs for fertilizer, that's a big ask for grain farmers of Ontario right now. We're facing affordability and supply threats because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and just globally, as well as tariffs on, imported Russian and Belarusian fertilizer. Seeds and pest management tools, those are slow to be commercialized. These inputs are really foundational to making sure that we can have that solid foundation of production over time. And we need the ability to process what we produce here. So this is a big point of conversation across Canada right now in terms of the sort of missing middle of value added processing. So we grow the crops, we have downstream, tertiary processing capacity, but a lot of the middle processing capacity where we're taking crops, turning them into ingredients or feedstocks to go into the sort of secondary or tertiary processing, baking, what have you, food manufacturing. There's some gaps there. So we often send agricultural commodities away, bring them back as value-added process inputs, and then either further process them or feed them to our population. So we need to solve for some of that. There's some critical pinch points there. And when I look at sort of this build, partner, buy framework in the DIS strategy, I think that for a long time in some of those areas we've been buy, partner, build in agriculture. And we need to sort of flip that on its head and think about, okay, what is it going to take for us to truly build here? So I won't wax too much more on this, but I'd say like a big difference that I see is that in the defense strategy, government procurement is a major lever and influencer for commercialization, scaling, and investment. We don't have that same lever within agriculture. Yes, there's opportunity for more government procurement of Canadian food and inputs and things like biofuel that's made out of agricultural inputs, but I think we need to think a little bit more broadly about what are the other levers government has in terms of supporting the business environment, predictable regulations, and making it a place where people want to invest and build in more value-added processing and more critical input supply. So I'll probably stop there, and then hand it back to you, Dr. Sharif.
That was wonderful, Dana, and it was great. I think it really re-emphasized and highlighted the importance of not just producing, but also processing and transporting. And I think, Brody also talked about, the various different parts of the chain. And I think, this is probably going to be one of the recurring themes of today's conversation. So let me go to Virginia before we go to and we have a bunch of really important questions that we need to still talk about. So Virginia, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It is great to represent Alberta Innovates on this panel. For all of you that are not very related to Alberta Innovates, we are a funding agency focusing on advancing innovation, supporting the development and adoption of new technologies across sectors, but my particular team focuses on the agri-food sector. So what I took from the DSI, from an innovation, research, and development perspective, the strategy shifts the focus from research in isolation to building a complete system of capabilities. I like that it emphasized that we need to set a clear demand indicators and working much more closely with industry. That is quite critical because innovation doesn't really scale up without a predictable market pool. It also recognizes that research and development alone is not enough. It puts a real emphasis on demonstration, commercialization, procurement, scale up, essentially tries to close the gap between that invention and deployment. It also has a very strong focus on securing supply chains, as it has already been alluded by our panelists. So once again, we have mentioned that while DIS doesn't explicitly mention the agri-food sector, all these under line logic applies very well for the sector. So what I took for the interpretation of the DIS on the agri-food sector is that food systems, we all acknowledge, are foundational for the country, for the infrastructure, for providing food. We need to really look at agri-food in the same way that we look at defense. We need to have that reliable produce, process, distribution of food domestically, and then looping it back once again to the research and development component. Well, Canada is strong in agricultural innovation and research. However, I think we still struggle to translate this into a scale, commercially adapted solutions. The DIS once again explicitly addresses this gap by linking that innovation to procurement and scale, which is once again what we need. We very related to this. We need to emphasize on that domestic capability. We know that is relevant. I will say that we still need to focus on primary production. That's one of the strongest aspects of the country, and I don't really think we should overlook it and switch to just to other areas, but keep that primary production, and then also bring forward other critical areas such as inputs, fertilizers, food processing, that intermediate supply chains, definitely very important, as Dana was alluding to. But once again, my point will be to still focus on what we're strong and then strengthen the weakness that we have. So another thing very related to this is the supply chain risk, the need to really enforce this, or to really improve the fact that we're still, once again, producing primary grains, but we also need to produce that, to have the food, the ability to produce our food in the country. So one other aspect that I like from the DIS, and that has already mentioned, is that focus on dual use technologies. That's very relevant. So we have currently technologies in the sector such as artificial intelligence is all over, sensors, automation, data system support. Those technologies are relevant both for defense and agriculture, and we are already working on it. So we will be like, one aspect will be to really strengthen that. We know that we have precision farming, we do traceability, we work in biosecurity. So there's really a real opportunity to think about this agri-food as part of that broader DIS. I guess that the closing, my closing point is that the DIS really provides a very useful framework, not just for defense, but thinking more broadly about resilience. From an innovation perspective, once again, the opportunity is probably to ensure that we're just not supporting discovery, but actually building that domestic capacity to deploy, scale, and sustain those innovations, those technologies over time.
That was a fantastic segue, Virginia, to the next question, because the next question is going to be talking about some of the capabilities within DIS that can be leveraged for agriculture. And you talked about, some of the really critical technologies and components. I'm also just going to, maybe follow up on some of the things that you talked about, like artificial intelligence, application of artificial intelligence in defense, and also applications of artificial intelligence in agriculture. I'm also going to add cybersecurity threats for agriculture and what we can learn from those and apply them to defense, and vice versa, or GIS for that matter, and analysis and assessment of agricultural farmland, and how that can actually be applied for assessments that are needed, for example, for defense purposes. And in fact, I know that across universities, there's significant amount of interest among a variety of different people for those kinds of dual use research. So I think, the future is going to be very interesting, very dynamic, very, very interesting, because we are going to see a lot of these technologies come to the fore because people not only have been working on them, they are internationally renowned in Canada, and this is really giving them permission and giving them, the impetus, to put them, to a different use. So let's see what happens in the future. But having said that, as I said, this was a very good segue to the next phase, which is asking questions from two of our panelists, and each of the panelists would have approximately 2 or 3 minutes to answer, and other panelists can also jump in. If they feel that they need to jump in, by all means, please do. So let me just ask the first question from Brody and Dana. So the DIS has identified 10 specific sovereign capabilities of Canada to develop and maintain. What, in your mind, what are the top 2 or 3 capabilities related to the agriculture sector that Canada should develop and maintain to guarantee national resilience in connection with the strategy? So, not sure if Brody, you want to go first, or Dana, you want to go first?
Why don't you go ahead, Dana, since I went first last time?
Sure. Well, mine aren't going to be as it like they're gonna sound a little boring maybe. They might not be as exciting on the AI side. I think there's a lot we can, cover when it comes to advanced technology. But I would say on the farm side, innovation isn't always, the show horse. Sometimes it's the workhorse, right? So the three kind of things that I highlighted were farming as a profession. So farmers today, in my view, it's very much a STEM profession, right? Like a farmer needs to be an agronomist, they need to be a financial analyst, they need to be a mechanic, they need to be a chemist, they need to be a meteorologist, they need to do all of these things. And we're facing a massive farm transition in this country, right? We have many farmers that are going to be passing over either to the next generation or even more likely a lot of new people to farming. So thinking about how do we ensure that we have capabilities to have productive, technologically advanced, modern farmers and have that be a profession that is invested in and has, that our farmers have all the tools and knowledge that they need to keep that capability resilient and diversified and not overly consolidated, I think is a really important capability for us to maintain. The second one, I think, and Brody and I have already talked a bit about this, is critical inputs. So, we've really been exposed in recent years, especially in Eastern Canada, on fertilizer inputs. We have serious gaps in production and access of fertilizer. We import fertilizer from markets that we currently have tariffs on or that are currently being disrupted from geopolitical events. That's adding to a huge amount of cost, and we can't grow food if we don't have fertilizer. And we can't have economically resilient farms if that fertilizer isn't affordable for farmers. And margins are really thin right now, right? Like we have very low commodity prices. So this is the kind of thing that, we shouldn't wait for a crisis to deal with this. We're in a crisis right now. These sorts of things take a long-term approach to build up capability in. So when I think of that framework of, buy, partner, build, right now we're buying. It takes a long time to build these things. We should work towards having the environment where we can build them and have strategic reserves for fertilizer and other critical inputs. In the meantime, we need the government to look at how do we make sure that farmers can buy these things affordably and secure access to them. And then finally, I would say, yes, the processing capacity capabilities. I already talked a little bit about this, but really, crushing, milling, distilling, grain cleaning, livestock processing, like precision fermentation, like all of this sort of primary processing of primary agricultural products. Where we have gaps, we need to look at addressing those over the long term so that we're not reliant on imports. And I'd say the other thing is we need to make sure that all the capacity we have today in downstream processing and baking is seen as too important to fail.
Mhm.
So, if Ontario's pork industry lost one of its abattoirs tomorrow, that would have significant ripple effects within the industry from pork to grains and all kinds of other areas. So I think the government needs to look at those as too important to fail and what happens if something does fail and how do we make sure that we're replacing that capacity or planning for the future so that we have excess capacity so that those impacts aren't as significant.
Excellent. Thank you, Brody.
Well, I'm glad that I'm following Dana because I'm going to be in complete agreement with just about everything that she said. That should make it easier for our audience too, because we'll be consistent. Maybe I'll just take a bit of a slightly different tack on a couple of those things, but ultimately land in the same place. So I fully agree on innovation as a critical capability in the agriculture sector right now. The CFA released a report a couple of years ago now on data as a foundation for sustainable productivity growth in the agriculture sector. We really do see investments in data and innovation as that linchpin between improving our productivity and our yield and supporting our sustainability and environmental objectives at the same time. It's also going to support a lot of our labor constraints over the long term. And I do want to stress that for sure. On the processing capability, couldn't agree more. I mean, this is something that we've been profiling and are continuing to profile as a priority in our advice related to the next agricultural policy framework. So, and much like the Defense Industrial Strategy or Canada's defense policy are sort of those framework, policy documents in the defense world. The agricultural policy framework, which is a 5-year federal, provincial, territorial framework, is kind of that big piece in the ag space. And we're trying to link these things so that it's not just ag in isolation, but ag in the context of what would a whole of government lift look like to support the agriculture sector as a national priority. On the defense side, there are a number of areas where we see some clear linkages, which I can talk about in a second, but value-added processing and infrastructure funding flowing through ISED, I think is another one. And we absolutely need that because it supports our trade diversification objectives. It makes us more resilient as a country and less susceptible to those vulnerabilities and shocks, geopolitical shocks, et cetera. So I couldn't agree more on that point, Dana. I did also want to pick up on your point on the critical inputs because this is, I think, this is the low-hanging fruit, if I could put it that way, in terms of areas that we need to focus on from a food security as national security perspective. More than 80% of our active antibiotic ingredients are coming from China and India. Pesticides are predominantly manufactured in India, China, and the United States, Germany, and Japan to a certain extent as well. We rely on China and Russia and Morocco for phosphorus fertilizer, like exclusively. Fertilizer is coming from Russia, Belarus, China, Russia, Morocco, as I said. Those costs have increased substantially since the conflict with Iran, upwards of 30 and 40%. We're also heavily reliant on the United States for the import of large equipment and machinery to support the agriculture. So, I mean, I could go on and on about this. Also, we've seen 62 transportation-related work stoppages over the past 2 years in the agriculture sector. 2 years, 62. That's crazy. So you can see how vulnerable the whole agriculture system is to external factors and variables, some external to the country, some internal to the country. But what we don't have is a systematic mapping of where those vulnerabilities are with a sense of urgency around where we're most vulnerable and a strategy on how we can address them. So I think that, while I hesitate to sort of pick one or two or three of those critical vulnerabilities, I would say the first step is we need to do a broad system-wide vulnerability assessment. And that will hopefully illustrate where those key vulnerabilities are, and then we need to put a plan in place to address them.
That's exactly why we have the four of you around this table, because this is amazing. At least, as far as I can see, it's been amazing. It's been really educational for me. And Dana, you opened your remarks by talking about talent development and what a farmer actually looks like at the moment. And it's not, that sort of mentality that we had, that red building, with the tin roof, that has long gone, and it has been replaced, by a farmer who's a chemist, who's an accountant, who's a financial manager, who is an agricultural thought leader, decision maker. And that's basically, something that we have to, come to realization. I think, we are really preaching to the choir here, but I think, our government, not just the federal government, but governments in general need to understand this better. Let me ask if Ian and Virginia have any additional comments, and if not, I'm going to go to the two of them for my second question. Excellent. So let me ask you, maybe Virginia, I can start with you, and then I'm going to go to Ian. What are the specific domestic processing and refining capabilities that you think are most strategically important to develop? And I think Dana kind of actually alluded to some of that. And how must national security strategies align with Canada's existing agricultural priorities?
So I will say there are three. So number one, critical agriculture inputs and upstream production capacity. We've been talking about that, particularly in areas like fertilizers and key inputs. Those are pretty much foundational for food production. The DIS does make a strong case for securing access to essential inputs, whether that's critical minerals, industrial materials, or other components, because more often than not, these are quite vulnerable points in a crisis. And we have seen that with the geopolitical situation that we are going through. So also the same principle really applies. So if access to these inputs is disrupted, once again, production quickly follows. Needless to say, we need to ensure them or at least have diversified and reliable access to them. Another aspect, and coming from a science plant background, I see this to be quite important, is biosecurity and life sciences capacity. And that's, once again, the DIS defines this as a core processing capability to deal with these two aspects. So I will say that DIS highlights the importance of life sciences infrastructure in maintaining national security. There is a strong component when it comes to plant, animal, food system biosecurity. We need to have that ability to better detect, manage, and respond to biological risks. You were alluding at the beginning as some issues that we're having with certain virus. We went through the pandemic. So I will say that this is probably as important as having physical infrastructure. Once again, having that ability to properly and early detecting, manage, and responding to these biological risks. And then another aspect that has been discussed, and I'm sure is going to be discussed in different questions, is the food processing and value-added capacity. We know very well that we're a major producer of primary commodities, and as I mentioned before, I will really encourage ourselves to keep doing so, to keep being a primary producer. But we remained very dependent on external systems for certain types of processing. So from a resilience perspective, it's probably realistically not going to be enough to produce raw inputs. We're going to need to have that capacity to transform, refine, and distribute it for our own systems. And that once again aligns very well with the DIS. So I think there is another part of the questions that says like pretty much how this national security is going to align to our priorities. Well, I will really think this is equally important. One of the strengths that the DIS has is that it does recognize that alignment and coordination. So to allude to a point that I made in the first question, I think we really need a stronger engagement with industry coming from a funding agency. We really see the need for a way more integrated approach across government and industry to really enable investments at different scales. So this alignment may mean that resilience objectives should really cover some core priorities. So name productivity, sustainability, being competitive, market development. So All this together means that if we want industry to invest in domestic processing and and capacity, we really need to have stronger long-term indicators or signals and reduce that fragmentation that sometimes we still deal with at the innovation and research stage, and really support that commercialization, not just the early stage innovation, but bringing them all the way to commercialization. So just recognizing that sometimes we're going to have to invest in some aspects that at the short term may not be the cheapest or the most cost efficient, but that is going to provide that critical insurance for times of disruption, for the lack of a better word. So yeah, I will once again say that I mean, like if I was going to put this in a sentence, I will say that the more strategic areas will be to secure access to agricultural inputs, strong biosecurity systems, and domestic processing.
Wonderful. Hold on to some of those thoughts. We are going to come back to those. Ian.
Yeah, I think I'll be repeating a lot of what Virginia said, because I think she nailed it, and I think Dana and Brody had brought up the other core pieces. I think we're repeating that critical input space, and I'm glad they brought it up first, because I feel selfish to say it, working for CropLife Canada, who represents a portion of the input providers for the country, whether it be the seed varieties that farmers use, or the crop protectants, whether they be biologicals, synthetic chemicals, or plant-derived chemicals for organic or conventional growers. If we don't have access to those inputs that farmers need to put the crop in the ground, then the food doesn't come out afterwards, and there's nowhere to send it. And processing capacity isn't as important if you don't have the food to process. But back to that original question of how must the security strategies align with our existing agricultural priorities? I think they do. A strong agricultural sector intrinsically supports a security strategy. So I think it's there. The strategy might not reference agriculture by name. We might be missing some of those specific point outs, but I think there's already a high degree of alignment of what we're trying to accomplish in agriculture and having a robust Canadian agriculture sector, and what we're looking for from a security strategy. Maybe just to put another, you asked for some specific examples. Going back to Dana's point on the dual use piece, you can imagine if you get into a major geopolitical issue and we're not able to send as much product out, we're going to have a lot of grain stuffs that are available for dual use processing. So biofuels manufacturing in Canada becomes a great opportunity. It insulates us from trade challenges. And also, it seems the only thing that is insulated from trade challenges is oil. That can always move somewhere, somehow. So if you have to send the oil out of the country, what fuel are we using in the country? And we have all these foodstuffs that can be diverted. So we'll get to, in a later question, talking about how do we make sure that happens, but can people build those plants? Are the regulations in place to allow the crops to exist that would fit those uses better? So I think to kind of sum it up back to what others had said, it is the critical inputs that are so important. Fuel being another one of them, because if you can't put the fuel in the tractor, you can't get the seed in the ground to put the fertilizer in the tractor to put on the crop. But that comes into that dual use piece. So I think that those critical inputs, fuel, fertilizer, seed, and crop protection, become the basis of whether we have a functioning agricultural sector moving forward. And then we can get into the bottlenecks in processing and making sure that those are also resolved.
Very interesting, Ian. You must have read, the questions, because the next question and a few others are going to be talking about some of the topics that you just brought up. But let me go to our next question for Dana and Virginia. How do we ensure that agri-food security moves beyond just R&D and pilot programs to building domestic production depth and surge capacity? And I think, Ian, you just touched upon some of that. And some of these infrastructures that are going to be needed for and necessary to withstand global supply chain shocks. So maybe I can go to you, Virginia, because you're on a roll. So please go ahead. And if you see my finger going up, it means that you have 1 minute.
Okay. So I will say that one of the most important messages of the DIS is that innovation alone does not create resilience. And I think I could just finish there. That sentence says it all. Once again, innovation alone is not going to create resilience. What is going to create resilience is going to be that combination of innovation and domestic production capacity, secure supply chain, the ability to scale and deploy solutions in real world conditions. So a few aspects to highlight is that I will say that we need to define or redefine what success looks like. Too often success is measured, at the pilot scale. So providing that technology works. But from a resilience perspective, success should be whether that solution is actually adopted at a scale and really embrace into Canada's production system or just into the agri-food production system. I like that the DIS makes this very explicit and it focuses a bit on commercialization, procurement, development, not just research. Number two, I will say we need a clear demand indicators and pathways to scale. So the DIS does emphasize that industry, and I know I've been talking about that, will only invest in capacity if there is predictability and alignment to government priorities. So if they see an advantage for them, they're going to invest on it. And I think that's the reality. We what we need is really that domestic production, that processing capacity, new technologies that can be deployed at a scale. And we really probably need to move a little bit beyond those short-term programs that are probably lacking those long-term signals that are going to support investment. Number three, we need to really build that domestic production. Once again, we need to go in depth. We need to have that capacity. We need to really strengthen the supply chains. And this may mean that we need to identify those vulnerabilities. Once again, inputs are very important, processing, and then just kind of build what the DIS refers as that redundancy and domestic capacity. So, and then another thing is that we really need a better system to be more aligned across across departments, across all the aspects of the agri-food value chain. It is a very broad sector, and we need to have that connectivity, that innovation that is going to be connected across the different aspects, but also have that industrial or that industry support. So I will say that overall it's just not simply more innovation, more research for the sake of research, more small pilots, but it's really that innovation that is going to have that infrastructure, that support from industry, and that is going to operate in a reliable manner under disruption.
Great. Thanks very much, Virginia. Dana, please jump in.
Yeah, all great points. I'm gonna pick up on what Virginia was talking about and what Ian brought up on biofuels and just give you like a practical example of of an area where we need to move past for more value-added processing capacity. We're currently reliant on imports, and it really relates back to what Ian was talking about with biofuels. I completely agree. I would say it's not only a dual-use technology, it's a triple-use technology. So biofuels made, so corn ethanol or soy or canola-based biodiesel, they decarbonize the transportation system. They provide fuel sovereignty for Canada, so we can produce our own fuel, and it's also an affordable fuel for the most part. So right now, like corn ethanol has been supporting gasoline prices, not getting overly inflated, despite what's happening with the price of oil in the Strait of Hormuz. And they provide food security. And I know that's often up for debate, but when you look at corn going through an ethanol plant, we get DDGs that are a high protein, nutritionally powerful ingredient for livestock feed that anchor demand for corn and production for corn here so that our livestock sector can have access to that feed. Same thing with soy. You need to process soy in order to get meal and oil, and that meal is a really important input into animal feed. So I think it covers those three technologies. And to give you an example of how we move beyond into actual domestic processing depth today, So in Ontario, we produce quite a bit of soy. About 50% of our soy is exported globally because we don't have the crushing capacity to process it. So we only have 3 crush plants in Eastern Canada, and we're exporting a huge amount of commodity soy. It's going into markets like China, Iran, and the US, which are all markets that have been, let's say, uncertain markets for exports over the past year. So there's a huge opportunity to reshore some of that soy, but we need that processing capacity here. And we need a clear, predictable signal for biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel production from the Canadian government's clean fuel regulations and associated policies so that people will be confident in building that crush capacity and building that value-added processing here in Canada versus just importing it from elsewhere. Very similarly on ethanol, demand for ethanol in Canada has increased substantially over the past 5 years under the clean fuel regulation, but we're importing 60% of our ethanol from the United States, where it is heavily subsidized and supported by government policy, and Canadian ethanol plants that are using corn in Ontario are really struggling to compete against that. So there's a huge opportunity to expand production of ethanol here, anchor more corn demand, produce more dried distillers grains and byproducts for our animal feed sector. But the problem is that our ethanol companies don't see that long-term predictability in policy for them to invest in that expansion, even though the demand has been soaring for ethanol. So we need to make sure that they're competitive. We need to have a business environment. We need both sides of government having that long-term predictable signal, so that companies can invest here and be resilient and competitive globally and process more of that here at home.
Very good. It's again, a very good segue, to the next question, which is about not necessarily everything that you, Dana, and you, Virginia, talked about, but you did mention some of the components of what is required, for innovation, for promoting innovation, and also for adoption of innovation and so forth. And to achieve the speed of innovation that is championed by the DIS, how should our regulatory environment adapt? And I think, to the panelists, I must have mentioned that, I heard from a thought leader that someone said the US makes things, another country that shall remain nameless usually copies things, and Canada has a tendency to regulate things. So what's the cost of regulatory friction to our national resilience? And I have the question open to you, Ian and Brody, and I know that you have lots and lots of thoughts to share. So please go ahead.
Yeah, probably too many, because this is the area that I work in the most, is in the regulatory space, and how to encourage innovators to either invent things in Canada or bring their innovations to Canada as quickly as possible. Want to make sure that farmers here are getting access to those critical inputs that Dana and Brody mentioned earlier, but get access to them at least as quickly as other countries, if not before other countries do. So we have the competitive advantage. But what do we have to do to reach that kind of pace? I think often you'll hear people say, well, words are just words, but action often starts with words. And the ambition that's in the industrial strategy is kind of the words we need to hear to get things started. And then how do we change that mantra in Canada, where, as you said, Canada just regulates things? And this is not a negative toward our regulators. We have excellent regulators in this country, brilliant scientists that work there, but I don't think they've been tasked with kind of a revision to their mandate, which is absolutely health and safety first, but with a business enablement mindset. How are you ensuring health and safety with a business enablement mindset? And if you can do that, we can see a lot more things happen in Canada. Whereas if you're just focused on health and safety and you're not trying to do it through a business enablement mindset, you can leave things on the books. There might be 4 different ways to do something. And it would be natural. Well, let's pick what is the cheapest or the easiest for the government to apply, not what is the most likely to encourage activity in the country when it comes to innovation. So the regulatory friction is quite serious. And we've seen that when we've had trade disruptions before, where we might need to switch suppliers very quickly from one country who is supplying us with something to someone else. This might be something we can't onshore. But if there's a long regulatory process to switch from one provider to another, and we can't pick up on the elements of how we can make that happen quicker, you can end up with gaps in your production system that are crippling. So it starts with this ambition toward a faster regulatory system, and how do we get there? And then acknowledging where we are. We're currently 32nd out of 36 in the OECD for general regulatory burden across the board. Now, some people will debate that and go, well, the top 4 countries don't have any regulatory systems. That's not really fair to say that they're really fast. They just have no system. And fair enough. We can debate some of it. But as my father would say, if the number's really bad and you cut the number in half and it's still really bad, don't spend time equivocating on the details. You have a problem, get moving. So, so even if we're only half that bad, we're 16th, we're still not close to the top 10 in the OECD. That's not acceptable for Canada. So I think trying to leverage the DIS into the government mantra of how we're amending our regulations and moving them forward will be critical for agriculture taking benefit from that and seeing the kind of innovations we need to see in Canada.
Wonderful. And your father must be a very wise man. Brody.
Yes, I was just going to say the same. Sounds very wise. Pretty hard to argue with any of that and hard to follow. A couple of things I would just say really quickly. So, one, actually, I was just testifying before the House of Commons Finance Committee this morning on implementation of Bill C-30. So this is the spring economic update, and in it there are a couple of divisions specifically related to amending the mandates of the Pest Regulatory Directorate and the CFIA to adopt more of that economic and food security lens in the mandate of those organizations. We think these are very positive developments from our perspective, overdue. But I do want to stress also, the point that Ian made around regulations are really important. It supports our credibility internationally as a trusted, reliable supplier of high quality agriculture and agri-food products. So we need these regulations. We just need them to be more balanced in the considerations around health and safety and also economic and food security considerations. And so we're seeing some positive steps in that direction because the status quo is simply not acceptable. Ian mentioned our OECD ranking. Totally agree. We also have some numbers that suggest that Canadian producers face delays of 2 to 5 years in accessing technologies that are already approved in other countries that we would have deemed, trusted jurisdictions. I heard an example from Australia where same product that is just being approved right now in Canada was approved in 2021 in Australia just by virtue of the delays in approval. So I think that we've clearly got an issue here. The speed of innovation is not an abstract concept for farmers. It directly affects what farmers can produce, how much they can produce, and how reliably they can respond to shocks, which links to our broader discussion around national security. So I just want to leave it there for now, but I think there's really an issue here that we need to be addressing. This needs to be a priority for the Government of Canada. And once again, regulations, the Treasury Board Secretariat, they hold the levers in many ways that we need to move forward as an agriculture sector that goes beyond just agriculture and agri-food Canada. This needs to be a whole of government lift, and this is a key lever that we need to pull. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Brody said. And I think what Brody and I have talked about answers one of the questions that was in the chat about what needs to change, and they were asking about novel food specifically, and not to get deep into the novel food space, but I think it's that mantra of tasking our regulators to be as innovative in the approach they take to regulation as we're asking the industry to be innovative in their innovations. We need the same passion for change and new things in regulation that these kind of strategies and the general growth strategy this government has is asking of industry. And that's often where the friction point comes. Folks are asking industry to be really creative and invest and drive, and we need to see the same passion and innovation in regulation at the same time.
Great. Thanks very much. And this is our last question, last formal question, and this is again for you, Brody and Ian, but everyone else can also jump in here. So we talked about how industrial policy in Canada is applied, and in our case, in the context of defense and in the context of agriculture, it's sort of it's a cross-sectoral, cross-departmental strategy and policy. But the reality is that when there are too many cooks in the kitchen, sometimes no one wants to take care of what they're cooking. So it's a known fact. And Brody, you talked about ISED. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada obviously is also one of the leaders in this area. This is also related to D&D. But how would we be able to identify, and we are not in a position, to advise the government per se, but, if we were to make a recommendation in terms of having a single point of contact for the government and for various different departments under a unified national resilience strategy, that we would have agriculture and food as one of the focal points, as one of the central foundational pillars of that. What are your recommendations? How should we go about doing that? And I'm imagining that some of our government colleagues are attending today's webinar. What are your thoughts? Maybe we can start with you, Brody, because you brought up ISEC.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for that question. This is a really important one. I've alluded to this a couple of times in my remarks, so I'll try not to be repetitive. And I might say something that you might not expect here, because my sort of visceral reaction to that question is yes, of course. I mean, obviously. I mean, that's exactly what we're looking for, is if we want to operationalize this vision of seeing agriculture as a national priority, we need the governance, we need the infrastructure behind it to support that mandate and mission. The reality is, as a former public servant myself, and having recently spoken to a few fairly senior former public servants on this very question, because we've been trying to figure this out, machinery changes in the government of Canada are very fraught. With the best of intentions, they can produce positive results, but more often than not, it becomes the outcome itself. The outcome becomes the change, and there is no subsequent actual meaningful movement in the actual area that we're focusing on. And it eats up a lot of time, and it eats up a lot of resources. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term machinery changes, I apologize, that's a bit inside baseball, but it's basically when you change mandates, like over architectures of who's responsible for what in the government of Canada. You create new industry agencies, or you create new departments, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what we need to do is just ensure that agriculture is considered a national priority. I think that needs to start at the top, and it needs to start at the center. And when we start to hear this language coming out more and more, and those signals are sent, I'm optimistic that we will see the relevant portfolios in this space, many of whom you've mentioned, Dr. Sharif. So I said on infrastructure, transportation, we cannot forget, critical infrastructure, Treasury Board Secretariat on the regulatory space, Health Canada on regulatory, especially when it talks to agriculture files, arguably the Defense Department as well, Global Affairs Canada, immigration policy, ESTC on labor and skills training. All of these portfolios play an important role in supporting our food and food security and national security. We need that strong signal from the center that agriculture is going to be prioritized, and hopefully we will see. There are several ways that you could accomplish this as well without having to go to sort of, very restrictive and often process-oriented, burdensome machinery changes. We can look at things like stronger governance tools between departments to force that collaboration and alignment. You can even look at more operational and HR tools, like embedding experts from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in some of these other portfolios to lend their expertise. They've got tremendously positive and productive networks and relationships with the industry at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. That's something they can bring to the table in those other departments that don't necessarily understand how to navigate the sector. So I think there are other possibly easier lifts that we can look to accomplish that objective, but the principle is sound. We need more of an all-of-government approach to agriculture and food security as a national security priority in this country. And that goes without saying, and I do want to stress that certainly that's a position that we support at the CFA, and we'd be open to exploring different options on how to get there.
Great. Thanks very much, Brody. Ian.
I'll keep it very short. I fully agree with what Brody said. I think it's a little less about a single point of contact or a czar on the piece as it is a cultural change or a focus of the government that it takes this seriously, and that And we've seen it in other places. Right now, we're seeing red tape reviews come out of Treasury Board so that when you're doing something within a department, you're asking the question, how does this impact the overall burden of red tape? We've seen it in the federal sustainability strategy, which cut across all departments and set tone and set goals for different departments in there. So the government has the ability to set coordination function and drive things into the culture of the government. And then, so I think there's lots of opportunity under DIS, a great example of that. I think this is going to set the government focused, and that question will be asked, okay, so what is your new activity in whatever department contributing to the DIS? Is it contributing? Are you making sure it's not holding it back? Right? Those two pieces there. And then how can we get more agriculture either in the DIS or its own kind of lens to focus on? But I think it's more of a broader cultural piece. And not just to put it all on the government, industry also carries a role here. If we're not bringing solutions to the table for discussion, then we're not doing our part. We can't just ask the government to solve it all for us. We have to be good partners in bringing well thought out ideas to the table.
Dana, please go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Brody and Ian said. And like to go back to my biofuel example as a practical example, like Brody's concept of making it a priority from the top and having that trickle down, I think is absolutely right. I look at the past 5 years I've had working on the clean fuel regulations, which regulate biofuels within Canada, which is really a regulation that sits within Environment Climate Change Canada, or if you look at the provincial mandates, it's within the Ministry of the Environment. And it's felt like over those past 5 years that it has been a single bottom line objective of decarbonizing the transportation sector with, benefits for agriculture or the biofuel sector being sort of co-benefits, nice to have. Like if that sort of happens, that's great. But like our primary objective is decarbonizing. And so we've been fighting tooth and nail to say, if these are policies that fail the domestic biofuel sector or fail to deliver for agriculture, then that's a failure of this policy. Like this policy should have a triple bottom line objective of yes, decarbonizing on climate, but also delivering sector economic opportunities. And if it's not delivering those opportunities, then that's a real issue, right? So I think if we have that as a priority and people think about, okay, how do we ensure food security as part of this other policy that is related, then we're going to see the right action and things coalescing to the right place. My other thought on this is it's not just within federal government departments, it's also federal, provincial, municipal, right? Like you can have a national trade priority that can get impacted by a disruption at a port that's housed within a municipality that has issues with neighbors. So how do we get all of those levels working together? It's almost an even bigger challenge. That's a real important thing for us, I think, to think about in terms of that coordination.
Very interesting points. I don't know, Virginia, I see that you unmuted yourself. Yeah, please chime in.
Yes, thank you. Definitely, we cannot really argue that we need that one single point. But I will just probably take that idea of the single point of contact a little bit of a step further. I will say that it's just not about helping companies or, well, having that single point, but it will be probably helping companies to develop and align their ideas with national priorities. We know that in practice, it's very difficult for private industry to navigate the systems. They have to go through different portals, different requirements. But sometimes one thing that we need to define when we're talking about private industry, are we talking about like those big players or SMEs that are probably one of the engines of what is of innovation in the province? What sometimes may happen with SMEs is that they may not come with fully developed ideas or proposals, not because their ideas are not as strong, but because the system may be too complex for them to navigate. So in that way, it's nice to have kind of a guided system or a system that guidance to really understand where where the real gaps are in domestic capacity, refine their solutions or their ideas to better address those gaps, and then sometimes connect them to the right partners among or across government, industry, and academia. So in that way, like once again, having that guided system, and I should point out as well, coming from a funding agency, this is something that we really work on, and we really try to define how we can better improve the experience of clients. And I should also point out that we do collaborate with other provinces, with federal agencies. Of course, we need to find a way to do that more efficiently. That is the question, but definitely we do try to do that.
Great. That's fantastic. This was a very good opportunity for me to educate myself and to learn a lot from our panelists. We still have a few more minutes. What I'm going to do, number one, is that for the audience, there's going to be a poll that's going to be sent. It's a demographic poll, so please try to fill it out at your leisure. Hopefully, yeah, here we go. Here it is. If you can fill that out, that would be fantastic. Number two is that we're going to go to questions. I know that if we have time, I'm going to go back to our panelists for some concluding remarks, but I'm afraid we may not have that much time. I see a lot of comments made by Mark Olson, and in those comments, we have a wide range of issues and situations, such as, for example, foot and mouth disease virus that could be quite costly. I agree with you. It could be quite costly, maybe more costly than any of the things, the bio threats that we've talked about. There's also some comments around accountability and innovation that are required for Canada to secure livestock animal traceability. Agreed. There's also some comments around adoption of agricultural technology and so forth. But let me just go to the questions. So there's a question, Dana, and this is sort of maybe not necessarily targeted towards you, but it's building on the point that you made about precision fermentation technologies and how food biomanufacturing could support our national resilience and food sovereignty. What changes or improvements do we think are needed in our regulatory frameworks to accelerate novel food approvals without compromising safety? Like I said, Dana, this is not necessarily targeted towards you, but I think you prompted the question.
I feel like this is an Ian one. I know, Ian, you commented on it earlier. You're really the expert, I'd say, on this. Do you want to pick it up?
I think what it is that there's dozens of specific elements of the novel food regulations that I'm sure every different category of the sector would want to talk about, but it's more about encouraging the regulators within those areas to be innovative in how they approach regulating that area. And it's not even just encouraging, it's allowing them to be creative. It's if the government is saying, no, we want you to try new things. We want you to look for new ways to do it. I don't think that's the tone that has been given to the regulatory departments has been, hey, get out there and try new things. It's typically been either keep it the way it was or add more. Like those are kind of the two acceptable activities. So you can't blame the regulator, the people who are doing the work, for not changing if they haven't been given the freedom to do so or the encouragement or the reward system by which to make those changes that would make it easier to get those products through. And if I might carry into the next question, because I saw the next one was related to education, which is something that I'm kind of took on. I happen to be a board member on Ag in the Classroom Canada, and the idea of agricultural literacy and science literacy, and what does that mean as a foundational building block for any strategy going forward. And I think that's really important and often forgotten, that what sometimes gets in the way of the policies that we want to pass in government is that technology it's a technology that the public hasn't had a chance to embrace or haven't had a chance to learn about, or they didn't teach enough of that in school for people to feel comfortable with the new health and safety policy that's going to come out. So if we don't find a way to make students more comfortable with ag, they won't be ready for the policies that come. If we don't inspire them to take part in ag, we won't have the STEM. And I think as Dana said, or Brody, like farming is a STEM activity. How do we inspire people? Otherwise, you end up with a workforce issue. How do you inspire people to study it so they'll want to go be a regulator and work in this space? So the education side is so important. And as we think about it with the defense strategy, if there's a learning from COVID, and hopefully folks will take this into defense, is that if you don't look at all your critical areas, so maybe it's fertilizers, pesticides, seed, technology, et cetera, and you don't educate your public to be comfortable with those technologies, it's very hard to then roll those out in an emergency situation. And I think we encountered that with vaccines. It's, vaccines are rolling along, weren't really doing a lot of extra education on the science behind what's coming in vaccines. And then when the moment arrived that we needed, we had to do a lot of talking in a very short time span that went well in some places and not so well in others. So how can you learn from that and go education in the key scientific areas of your strategy is important to do well in advance of needing the technology to hit the shelf.
Please go ahead, Dana. And I'm also just going to maybe, extend that to other members here, to other panelists, to talk about education and how you're going to be incorporating it into into your recommendations. But please go ahead, Dana.
Yeah, I was just going to build on that. And one of the reasons whenever I do my introduction, I mention the significance of corn, soy, and winter wheat within Canada and our production is because I feel like even within our industry or in some government circles, it's not known how much we produce here in Ontario of those three crops. I think when we think of agriculture, a lot of Canadians know about wheat and they know about canola and they know about the prairies or they know about beef and pork production, but there's a lot of crops and products that we produce and grow in Canada that are not as visible. And part of it is because they are, innovative functional ingredients in products that you don't necessarily realize are there. They get obscured by, their inclusion in a value-added food processing product. So we need to do a better job, I think, of educating society at large about what our agricultural productivity strengths are within Canada and the value of those ingredients as staple products and what would happen if we stop producing those. And and equally, I think there's a lot of interest in, okay, let's produce the next greatest thing that, whether it's insect protein or, there was a question about precision fermentation. And I think some of those things can be really valuable and huge opportunities, but they can also be really challenging to scale and maintain the investment that's required to make them as much of a staple product of some of what we're growing. So I think that broad education, continuing having conversations like this where we're talking about, what we're strong in and what we need to build upon in terms of that foundation are really important.
Excellent. I'm going to give my last comment to Virginia because she's unmuted herself.
I think I left myself unmuted, but thank you for
Okay.
giving me this comment. Regarding education, definitely agree with all the comments made above. I think one aspect that we have been trying to do is going to targeting young audiences, elementary school, junior highs, high schools. Well, needless to say, they're the future, and for them to have that understanding of the sector, quite important.
Wonderful. And I did actually say last comment is going to go to Virginia, but Brody, do you have any last comments that you would like to make on education or any other matter? In the interest of time, I think we're going to have to wrap up in 2 minutes. So please go ahead, Brody, if you have any last comments.
Why don't I just thank my co-panelists for their insightful comments here today. I think it was very helpful. I certainly found it useful. I want to thank you, Dr. Sharif, for moderating this discussion so well. From the CFA's perspective, I think the most important thing coming out of this is simply that we're shining a light on an issue that I think requires a little bit more attention. It does seem to be getting increasing traction in the context of some recent geopolitical events. And what we need to do now is take this conversation from theory to some practice. And the first step from our perspective is, as I alluded to earlier, I think what we really need to do is a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of where those risks lie across the entire agri-food system, and then share that with our government colleagues to sort of illustrate that this is not just an agriculture problem. This is a Canada and a defense and national security issue that we need to be paying close attention to. So thank you all.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Brody. And I'm just going to reiterate what Brody said. I just wanted to say that it was a very thoughtful and very engaging discussion. And I personally enjoyed it and benefited from listening to all the comments and really appreciated all the thoughtful comments and insightful comments that were shared by the panelists. And also thank you to everyone who joined us today. And last but not least, thank you to CSPC for organizing this webinar. I know that there's a lot of time and effort that has been put into it, so really appreciate it. And I see that in the Q&A, a person has posted something about how they can help with creating a broader network. To your point, Brody, that this is the time, to action. And hopefully, we can put all of our efforts together in order to be able to elevate the status of agriculture and elevate the importance of agriculture for our defense strategy and for our national sovereignty and national resilience. Having said that, I want to wish everyone a fantastic afternoon. Enjoy the afternoon. In Ontario, we are having such a wonderful weather. And I hope that wherever you're joining us from, you have a wonderful weather and wonderful afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Sharif. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.